The image that besets our minds when we think of love is that of a heart pierced by an arrow or the flying Cupid. Those who've had the misfortune of being hit by penetrating projectiles know that it hurts, especially if they puncture deep. To put it simply, it's not to be desired. What it symbolizes is a heart struck by Cupid's machinations. It is a heart in love. And people the world over have, in some way or another, been struck by Cupid's arrows. Popular music icons always proclaim that all you need is love. Many agree, with droves of people going out of their ways to invoke Cupid into action. And it's not just toward a romantic interest that this love is aimed at. It encompasses the totality of human social networks, that love is what connects us all together. In essence, love is the glue that's missing in our fractured and tumultuous world. Without it, things will worsen. With it, the world becomes better. It's all we need. For ancient physicians, this was not the case. A sole emphasis on love would deprive the body of its other requirements, effectively disrupting its delicate balance. It is in this regard that they considered lovesickness as a real disease. Ancient Greek medicine, the most dominant medical discipline in antiquity, was grounded on the idea of the four humors. Inside the body are humors that have varying qualities, with each having unique effects on one's health. How these humors interact with each other inside us largely determines our health. Of paramount concern is the ratio of each and how the body reacts to restore an ideal balance between them. Too much or too little of one will offset the scales, triggering health problems and diseases. As the god of love, Cupid, is the one responsible for delivering such internal disturbances. He does this by shooting his magic arrows at his chosen and often unwilling targets. It is in these sharp implements where the potential for emotional danger lies, because the ancient Greek word for arrows also means poison. So what Eros actually launches are poisonous projectiles, which, if with the right potency, can cause serious devastation. Those who've experienced rejection, abandon, or loss know how painful its effects can be. It can sometimes lead to a fatal case of the dreadful broken heart syndrome. The shared form between arrows and poison is of great interest to those studying the history of medicine, as it embodies the ancient style of understanding diseases with the use of symbols. To understand how significant the iconography of the arrow was to ancient medicine, we need to look back at the stories that have shaped its meaning across time. We can then, by careful extrapolation, excavate experiences buried underneath these stories that we can use to correlate symbolic meaning with their material reality. By doing so, our ideas of love will hopefully be enriched by ancient attempts to understand it, and as a result, if we're able to come up with a satisfactory explanation, have a more profound appreciation, even love, for history and past stories. To begin, it's best that we focus our attention on the person responsible for imbuing arrows with particular powers. Our main culprit is the god Apollo. Against him are stacks of evidence that point to his guilt as the main instigator, as the one who first contaminated arrows with divine toxins, thereby teaching preceding generations how to do so. But he did not design arrows to be used as a vessel for romantic emotions. Arrows, for him, were solely airborne vessels that unleashed pestilence and pain from a safe distance. The first instance of Apollo firing his noxious arrows is in Homer's Iliad. Chryses, a priest of Apollo, had his daughter Chryseis kidnapped by Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, as part of the monarchy's war booty. Fearing for his daughter's safety, he asked the Mycenaean warlord for her safe return in exchange for exorbitant ransom. This plea was swiftly denied, as Agamemnon took a liking for Chryseis. Horrified by the rude rejection, Chryses implored his favored god, Apollo, to intervene, which the god was happy to oblige. Apollo's wrath was only quelled when the invading Greeks, after an intense bickering between Agamemnon and Achilles, reluctantly returned Chryseis to her father. The barrage of arrows stopped, and so too did the fatalities. Had they continued to deny Chryses his request, the onslaught would have continued, ultimately thinning out the Greek contingent, since the foremost reason why Apollo had rained his arrows down on them was their disrespectful treatment of his priest. The act of kidnapping was only subsidiary to Apollo's wrath, as the capture of women, for either sexual conquest or slavery or both, was customary in times of war. The failure to appease Apollo's attendant, which by extension was an insult to the god, caused considerable damage to the Greeks, prompting them to quickly seek pardon. It is clear from the opening lines of the Iliad that what Apollo sent to the Greeks was a wave of plague carried forth metaphorically by his arrows, a clear example of how an arrow can simultaneously be poison. There is no doubt. that Apollo would have caused far greater devastation had he chosen to, for the power of his arrows was not only limited to inflicting death to mortals, but it also terrorized the divine. Apollo's threat surely held weight since the Furies heeded it, and this despite their reckless reputation to cause injury for the redress of vengeance. They knew that Apollo's arrows could cause them significant harm or even death, and their divine states, even more archaic than the Olympians, did not grant them any immunity. In the two examples above, Apollo's menacing arrows elicited a range of emotions culminating in two superlative measures. The Greeks must have surely felt regret for their impudence towards Apollo, and the Furies certainly experienced a rush of fear after the god issued his threat. Try as we might, it's difficult to exhume the emotion of love in these scenarios. If any, the arrows signified an end to it. Agamemnon probably loved Chryses, but the storm of arrows put his prospects to rest. The Furies loved to enact the spirit of revenge, but the peril posed by the arrows prevented them from accomplishing their mission. Nowhere is the later attachment of love and similar emotions found in Apollo's missiles. What we do find in his arrows are ancient attempts to illustrate the invisible threats of nature. Since arrows can be launched from a distance or from the safety of shadows, death from it can be hardly attributed to a definite source. It's hard to pinpoint the sole suspect in the death of a single soldier when 1,000 archers launched their missiles in his direction. Pestilence must have seemed to the Greeks like arrows shot by invisible archers. It was difficult to know who was shooting and who was to be hit next. A more convenient way to go about this problem was to attribute this havoc to divine beings who were invisible to human eyes. Infectious and viral diseases were thus placed at the quiver of Apollo, who was more than happy to launch them from his safe vantage spot in Olympus. Another Olympian feared for their arrows was, surprisingly, Aphrodite. We've come to know her from popular tales as the scheming goddess of love who mostly outsources her bidding to her son, Eros. But while the tales of childhood serve as a great introduction to the world of Greek mythology, they fail to prepare us for the subsequent chronological problem caused by a wider reading of the catalog. The ancient Greek writers failed to reach a consensus when it came to establishing Aphrodite and Eros' exact relationship with each other. Were they indeed mother and son? Hesiod's Theogony, c. 700 BCE, the oldest source at our disposal, does not draw a conclusive parental line from Aphrodite to Eros. In fact, he describes Eros as one of the first four divinities to have emerged alongside Chaos, Tartarus, and Gaia, appearing at an even earlier period than his supposed mother, who only surfaced after the castration of Uranus by his son Cronos. This order is affirmed by the late 6th century BCE Greek writer Parmenides, who wrote in On Nature that Eros was the first god to have been formed. This also means that Eros is far older than Apollo. Could it be that Eros was the original archer and Apollo only learned from him? Whatever the real reason may be, a reversal and adoption occurred where Eros became Aphrodite's son. This turn of events was instrumental in the association of Eros with arrows. Owing to their portable form, Aphrodite may have easily gotten herself some of Apollo's arrows and infused them with her powers, or, having seen their powerful capabilities, independently designed some for herself. At some point she may have surpassed Apollo in the craft, as Pinter describes her in his 5th century BCE Pythian Odes as the queen of sharpest arrows. However deadly her missiles were, the goddess found no beauty in the bow, so she assigned her son Eros to wield the implements for her. Euripides, a contemporary of Pindar, was the first, at least in the extant records, to describe the schemes of mother and son and their deliberate use of love-imbued arrows in Hippolytus. According to Euripides, Aphrodite wanted to punish Hippolytus for choosing Artemis over her. To exact the perfect penalty, she ordered her son Eros to shoot his arrows at Phaedra and make her fall in love with Hippolytus. Eros was happy to comply and love shortly blossomed. Problem was, Phaedra was Hippolytus' stepmother. The sudden and erratic arrival of love may have inspired the ancients to associate it with arrows, as both deliver unpredictable pangs of pain. It is easy to see in this association how Eros would have been the perfect candidate to hold and wield the bow.